She was just a girl when he found her, curled beneath burning beams, silent, eyes wide like the fire was still inside them. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask where they were going. Through forests, storms, and long winters, they traveled, together, not as fugitives, not as kin, but as two ghosts who'd somehow outrun the fire. He never spoke of the past, but every night, she took first watch, rifle across her lap, eyes on the trees. They say silence is heavy, but she carried it like a promise. This is not a love story. This is not a war story. This is the story of what happens when someone chooses to stay. Bafta. Welcome to the fire that never stopped burning. Chapter 1. The Fire and the Silence. The town had no name worth remembering, just a cluster of wooden buildings leaning into the wind, stitched together by dirt roads and bad luck. But that night, it burned like a city made of oil and sorrow. Flames licked the rooftops, clawing at the black sky, as if trying to pull the stars down with them. Screams rang out and vanished. Horses tore through the night, riderless and wild. Somewhere, a church bell rang not as a warning, but as if the fire had convinced even the holy to panic. He moved through the chaos, like someone who'd already lost too much to be afraid of losing more. Coat pulled tight, hat soaked in smoke, eyes narrowed against the heat. He wasn't a hero, not that night, not ever. But something in the way the roof groaned made him pause. Something in the way no one else ran toward the broken house made him step forward. It had already collapsed in parts. The doorway sagged, half swallowed by fire. But he heard it then, a sound, not quite a cry, softer, like breath caught in the ribs. He kicked through the frame, one arm shielding his face. Heat clawed at his skin. Smoke filled his mouth like regret. She was there, curled beneath a beam, knees drawn to her chest, soot covering her skin like a second birth, eyes wide, blinking slowly as if she wasn't surprised by the fire, just mildly annoyed it had taken this long to find her. He didn't speak, just reached down. She looked at his hand for a moment, truly looked in, then placed hers in it. It was small, trembling, and covered in ash, but she didn't resist. He carried her out as the house gave its final sigh and folded in on itself behind them. Embers shot into the air like angry birds. She never turned to look back. Outside, the streets were emptying. Faces lit by firelight darted between shadows. Someone called for help. Someone else wept. But the girl in his arms made no sound. She just stared ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, or maybe everything. He found an alley behind a saloon and set her down gently. Her dress was torn, one boot missing. But she didn't flinch, didn't cry. She looked up at him like she'd been waiting for this, not for rescue, but for the moment when the world would burn clean and leave her nothing else to carry. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the glow trembling. She watched him smoke in silence, and he said the only thing he would say to her for the next 3 days. "You hurt." She shook her head once. He nodded. They sat there until the sky turned gray, until the heat of the fire was replaced by the cold of dawn, until no one else came looking, and no one else asked why. He never asked her name. She never offered it. And just like that, without ceremony or explanation, they left the burning town behind. A man with a quiet past. A girl with nothing but ash in her lungs. No destination. No map. Only silence. And somehow, that was enough. Chapter 2. Ash on her skin. The smoke lingered long after the flames had died. It clung to their clothes, seeped into their skin, and settled behind their eyes like memories that wouldn't leave. They walked for miles through a world hushed by morning frost, the burning town shrinking behind them with every step, like a bad dream folding into itself. He didn't know where they were going, only that it had to be away. The girl followed without question. She moved like someone half awake, quiet, deliberate, almost weightless. Her steps left shallow prints in the snow-dusted dirt. She never looked back. Not once. Her skin was still streaked with ash, smudged across her cheeks and neck, dusted through her hair like burnt snowflakes. She didn't try to wipe it off, and he didn't ask her to. They made camp by a stream that first night, under the low-hanging limbs of a pine grove. He built a fire slowly, hands still stiff from smoke and exhaustion. She sat a few feet away, knees tucked into her chest, staring at the flames like she expected them to speak. He gave her a canteen and a half-burnt blanket. She accepted both without a word. When he turned to sleep, she stayed awake, just watching the fire, arms tight around herself, as if afraid the night might try to reach inside her and steal what little warmth was left. On the second day, he saw the burns, shallow ones along her forearms and a deeper one near her collarbone, not fresh, but angry. She didn't wince when she moved, but he noticed how she kept one hand cradled near her ribs, like something still ached beneath the silence. He offered to clean the wounds with creek water. She nodded once, sat still as stone while he worked. Her skin flinched, but her face didn't. No tears, no sound. There was a strength in her stillness that unsettled him. It wasn't the strength of someone brave, it was the strength of someone who had seen enough not to flinch anymore. They walked by day, rested at dusk. She followed his pace, but never too closely. He made meals from whatever he could trap or scavenge. She ate, small and slow, hands always clean, posture always aware. He spoke only once. "You don't have to be afraid now." She didn't look up, just kept eating, eyes fixed on the edge of the trees. She wasn't afraid. He realized that she was surviving. By the fourth night, she began to hum. Barely a sound, a string of half notes like the wind moving through pine needles. No melody, no words, but it was the first thing she'd given the world since the fire. He didn't interrupt, just listened, and slowly, their silence began to change. Not the kind that echoed with what hadn't been said, but the kind that allowed them both to breathe. The kind of silence that said, "You don't have to explain, I'm still here." In the morning, she dipped her hands into the stream, scrubbing gently at the soot on her skin. Ash lifted in slow ribbons, dancing away on the current. She watched it float downstream for a long while. He waited nearby, leaning against a tree, arms crossed. She didn't speak. He didn't ask, but something in her shoulders had softened just slightly, just enough, and as they packed up to walk again, the space between them narrowed by a few quiet steps. Chapter 3, The Cabin in No Man's Land. They found it on the fifth day, half swallowed by pine and silencer, small, sagging structure crouched at the edge of a dried creek bed. Its chimney cracked, its door hanging loose like the breath of the last person who lived there still lingered. It wasn't much, but it was standing, and in a world that seemed to prefer ash, that counted for something. The man stepped inside first, hand on his sidearm, eyes scanning shadows that hadn't moved. In years, dust coated everything in a thin, pale memory. A broken chair lay sideways near the hearth, and a tangle of empty bottles huddled beneath the table. No footprints, no voices, just the sound of wind brushing against old walls. He turned to her, gave a single nod. She stepped in carefully, not timid, cautious like a deer entering a clearing after gunfire. She touched nothing, only stood in the center of the room, eyes trailing along the ceiling, the rafters, the window, where light filtered in like a distant promise. They settled in without ceremony. He cleared the hearth, lit a fire. She swept the corners with a pine branch. He hung his coat near the door. She stacked rocks outside for no reason he could name. No words were exchanged. Still, it was clear they were staying. For now, the forest wrapped around the cabin like a secret. No paths, no fences, no echoes of neighbors, just trees. Endless, tall, whispering trees that breathed with them and watched without judgment. He hunted by day, gone for hours at a time. She never asked where he went. Instead, she observed the trees, the sky, the way the light changed at noon and the birds grew quiet before rain. She learned without books. She watched the world like it might teach her how to live. In the mornings, he found her sitting on the steps, arms around her knees, eyes locked on some distant thing he could never see. In the evenings, she helped skin rabbits, her hands surprisingly steady, her silence still intact. He didn't speak much, but he watched her, not like a protector, not anymore, more like a witness, watching a fire burn itself into something else entirely. Not gone, just changed. Once, he saw her place pine needles in rows beneath the window, aligning them by length. Another time, she braided a piece of bark and tied it to the doorknob like a charm. He didn't ask why. Some things didn't need reasons. At night, the wind pressed against the cabin like a slow exhale. Coyotes howled somewhere far off, and the trees creaked like they remembered every man who'd ever died in them. She never flinched. One night, as the fire cracked low, he looked up from sharpening his knife and saw her standing at the doorway, her silhouette framed by night, hair loose, head tilted. She wasn't looking out. She was listening to the dark, to the silence. maybe to the part of herself still trying to make sense of it all. He didn't speak, but in that moment he realized something that sat heavy in his chest. She didn't need saving, she needed a place that didn't burn. And for now, this broken, quiet cabin in the middle of nowhere was enough. Chapter 4. What She Never Asked. The days grew longer. The snow began to retreat into the shadows of the trees, and the silence between them deepened not in distance, but in understanding. The girl never asked him where he came from, never asked what he'd done or who he had been before the fire, and he never offered. Some truths hang too heavy in the mouth to speak aloud. Others are carved into the spine, carried in the way a man walks when no one is watching. At dusk, they ate together, side by side at the edge of the hearth, sharing dry meat and boiled roots, the fire throwing gold across their faces. She had learned how to patch his coat. He had learned to give her space. And neither of them spoke more than a few words from sunup to sundown. It was enough. But at night, the quiet cracked it started with a sound sharp, sudden, from his throat. A gasp, a choked name. Then the rustle of him sitting bolt upright in the dark, drenched in sweat, chest rising like he was still running from something in his sleep. The first time, she didn't move, just watched from her corner of the cabin as he paced, fingers clawing at the air like he was trying to grab something long gone. He didn't know she was awake. Or maybe he did and didn't care. He stared into the fire until it settled again, until the night grew quiet once more. He said nothing about it the next morning, and she didn't ask. But the next night, when the dream returned, louder, deeper, more violent, she did move, not with alarm, but with intention. She rose, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and sat near the door, her back against the wood, eyes fixed on the shifting shadows. She didn't try to wake him. She didn't touch him. She simply watched the night for him. That became her ritual. Each time his sleep broke into pieces, she kept watch. Every time he whispered someone's name into the floorboards, she listened. When he cried, outwards twisted and ragged, she stared into the dark like she was daring whatever haunted him to try and cross the threshold. And each morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. She stirred the fire, passed him a tin of water, and sat by the window with her knees drawn up, watching the light touch the tips of the trees. He noticed, he knew, but he still never spoke of the dreams. One afternoon, he caught her staring at him from across the table, not coldly, not with suspicion, just studying, like she was measuring the space between the man she lived beside and the man who screamed in the night. He lowered his eyes, but she never asked, and that not the silence, not the firelight, not the rifle resting beside the door was the thing that changed him. The not asking, the quiet mercy of it. She had seen enough to know the shape of his pain, and she had decided it didn't need to be spoken to be shared. That night, when he woke again, she was already sitting up, refilled across her lap, eyes steady. He looked at her. She didn't look away, and he didn't say thank you, but she stayed until morning, and sometimes that's all a man needs. Chapter 5. The Sound of Distant Hooves. It started as a tremble in the earth so faint that at first he thought it was just the shifting of roots beneath the thawing soil. But then came the rhythm, slow, heavy, deliberate, the unmistakable pulse of hooves, not a single horse, not wild, not distant for long. They were coming. He stood at the cabin window, jaw tight, eyes narrowed toward the tree line. The forest, once their shelter, had turned into a hallway of echoes. The rhythm was steady now, like a drumbeat counting down. Whoever they were, they weren't in a hurry, and that was the most dangerous kind of arrival. She was across the room, crouched near the hearth, stacking kindling with quiet hands. When he turned to her, she was already watching him, no fear in her eyes, just recognition. She didn't ask who was coming. She didn't need to. She had been waiting for this moment without ever saying so. He opened the cabinet beneath the cot and reached for the rifle, but she was faster. She stood, moved across the room like a whisper, and took it from his hands. For a second, he hesitated, eyes flicking from her face to the weapon. But she didn't flinch. She simply checked the chamber, ran her finger along the stock, and walked to the front door. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't showmanship. It was understanding. Outside, the snow had thinned, but the cold still bit at the skin. The trees stood still, their branches stiff like frozen fingers. She stepped onto the porch and sat on the top step. The rifle laid across her lap like it belonged there. Her coat hung open, revealing the leather strap she had tied across her waist like a makeshift belt. Her boots were uneven, scuffed, her hair hung low, loose. She looked like no one's soldier, but she sat like a sentinel. The hoofbeats grew, louder, now joined by the faint jingle of tack and the creak of saddles. Still no voices, no calls, just sound and presence and the weight of intention. He stood behind her in the doorway, hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the knowing. They had found him. After all this time, after all the running, and she, this girl who once came out of the fire like an ember with legs, was the only thing between him and whatever came next. She didn't turn, didn't speak, she simply watched the trail like it was daring her to blink. The riders never came into view, not that day. Maybe they changed their minds. Maybe the girl with the rifle sitting like a statue of silence unnerved them. Or maybe fate, just this once, took a breath and looked away. By sunset, the hoofbeats had faded. The forest swallowed them whole. She didn't move until the moon began to rise. Then, slowly, she stood, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and walked back inside. He stepped aside for her. She passed without a word. That night, he didn't dream. Not of fire, not of blood, not of the men who had once chased him through dust and guilt. He slept as if someone had placed a shield around the cabin. Not a wall, not a weapon, but a girl who once had ash on her skin, a girl who now sat between him and the world like silence, made flesh. And for the first time in years, he understood what it meant to be protected. Chapter 6. The rifle on her lap. The fire inside the cabin had burned low, just embers now, casting a faint red pulse across the wooden walls like a heartbeat that refused to die. The man slept restlessly beneath a fraying blanket, breath shallow, one hand still curled near the empty holster at his side. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old memory, soft, bitter, forgotten. She didn't sleep. She sat on the porch, her back against the post, the rifle laid gently across her lap, not gripped, not aimed, just resting, balanced like a final word. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes were wide open, staring not at the trail but at the dark between the trees. Still, alert, listening not for movement, but for intent. She had made a choice, and it wasn't born of fear. Behind her, he stirred again, a low noise in his throat, half a word caught in a dream. She turned slightly at the sound but didn't move from her post. The moon was thin tonight, a sliver of silver barely brushing the tops of the pines. The world had curled inward, holding its breath. She had not asked to hold the rifle. He had not told her to keep watch. Yet, here she was. She remembered fire, smoke, the weight of being carried, and now, the stillness of holding the line. She wasn't a soldier, she wasn't trained, but her hands were steady, and her silence was stronger than most men's fury. Somewhere deep in the woods, an owl called. She blinked once. The sound passed, like a wave over stone. She thought, maybe, about who he used to be. The man inside, the one who didn't speak much, the one who screamed only in his sleep. She didn't know what chased him across his dreams, what past he had buried beneath calloused hands and long stares. But she knew how to stand between him and whatever tried to come back. Dawn came slow. The sky lightened from charcoal to cobalt, the frost on the cabin roof sparkling like spilled glass. Birds began their cautious songs, and still, she did not move. When he finally stepped out, blanket still over his shoulders, hair a mess of sleep, he found her there, exactly as he'd left her, rifle on her lap, boots still in the dirt, eyes tired but clear. He looked at her for a long time, then, voice rough from sleep and something deeper, he said, "Thank you," not loud, not dramatic, just that. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither moved. She didn't smile, didn't nod, only stared into him with that same steady gaze, sharp and quiet like the mountains. And maybe that was her way of saying, "You're safe now, I'll keep watch." Chapter 7. The man who knew his name. It was late afternoon when the stranger arrived. The sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the clearing, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from the chimney like a thread of comfort. The man was sharpening a blade outside the cabin, slow and methodical. Each scrape against stone a rhythm he didn't have to think about. She was inside, stitching the torn lining of her coat. The rifle leaned beside the door like always silent, close. They didn't hear the horse until it was almost at the tree line. Not galloping, just a steady, deliberate trot, like its rider had no intention of sneaking or surprising. The man looked up, eyes narrowing against the amber glare of sun through pine. One rider, tall, worn hat, black coat, the kind of posture that spoke of authority without needing to shout. He knew before the man spoke. The stranger dismounted without a word, tied the reins loosely, and approached the porch with the calm of someone who had done this many times before. He didn't reach for a weapon, he didn't glance around. He simply looked the man in the eye and said his name, though one he hadn't heard aloud in years. It dropped between them like a gunshot. She stepped out of the cabin. Before he could speak, the door creaking softly behind her, she stood still for only a moment, eyes taking in the stranger, the horse, the weight of the moment, pressing against the clearing like a storm, about to break. Then she lifted the rifle, not with panic, not with anger, but with decision. The barrel pointed straight at the man's chest. Her hands were steady, her stance unwavering, and still, she said nothing. The stranger looked at her, looked, maybe trying to figure out what she was. A daughter, a prisoner, a survivor, but none of those titles fit. He opened his mouth to speak again, but something in her eyes, cold and wild and unflinching, closed it for him. She'll know who you are, the stranger finally asked, his voice low, edged. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, behind her now, breathing quietly. She'll know what you've done. Still no answer, only silence, and a girl with a rifle who wasn't going to lower it for ghosts. The stranger sighed, stepped back once, then twice. He glanced over his shoulder at the trail behind him, at the lengthening light. Something shifted in his jaw. Not defeat, recognition. Must be something, he muttered, almost to himself, to be worth that kind of loyalty. He turned, mounted his horse, and didn't look back. She didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats disappeared into the trees. Then, slowly, she lowered the rifle, exhaled through her nose, and leaned it once more against the wall by the door. The man stepped beside her. His hands hung useless at his sides. He wanted to say something, maybe explain, maybe confess. But she didn't ask. And that, once again, was her answer. That night, they ate in silence. The fire crackling like it always had, but something between them had changed. Not cracked, deepened, not broken, reinforced. He thought of the name the stranger had spoken, of the blood tied to it, of the past that never stopped following. And then he looked at her, this girl of few words and steady. Amand knew. She didn't care who he used to be. She only cared who he chose to be. When she was watching. Chapter 8. The Winter of Unspoken Things. Winter came like a breath held too long, silent, sharp and heavy. The trees froze where they stood. The stream by the cabin slowed to a whisper beneath a thick skin of ice. Even the sky grew quieter, as if the world itself had decided to go still. Inside the cabin, the fire burned lower each night. The man kept it going, but the woodpile had begun to shrink. Every crack of the logs splitting sounded louder than it should have. He rationed the food without saying it out loud, measuring portions with his eyes instead of words. The girl noticed. Of course she noticed, but like everything else between them, it went unspoken. She was thinner now. So was he. Hunger had a way of making even the bones feel exposed by midwinter. A cough settled deep in his chest. At first it was afterthought, something he could wave away, but then came the fever, creeping behind his eyes like fire had come back for him in a slower, colder form. She took over without hesitation. No drama, no panic, just motion. She fed him broth with quiet hands, wiped his forehead with the last clean cloth. When he tossed and turned through long, delirious nights, she sat by the cot, knees drawn up, one hand resting gently on his arm, not holding, just anchoring. The rifle stayed near, leaned within reach, always. He never told her what the dreams held, the fire, the horses, the voices, the guilt. But somehow she already knew, and still, she stayed. Once, in the blur of sickness, he reached for her and whispered a name not hers, not even someone alive. She didn't flinch. She just held the tin cup to his lips and let the name float away into the rafters, joining the other ghosts. When he was well enough to sit up, he tried to thank her. His voice cracked. She handed him a bowl of water instead. He drank. She sat across from him and broke a piece of stale bread in half. They ate without words, steam rising gently between them. Outside, snow fell like ash from a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. The roles had shifted. The girl who once needed carrying now carried the weight of the day. The man who once stood between her and the world now leaned on her stillness like a crutch he never asked for. But he trusted her, not because she promised to protect him, not because she made grand gestures, but because, in the face of cold, hunger, and the threat of loneliness, she stayed, and that meant more than any vow. He watched her sometimes as she stirred the fire or brushed the snow from the windowsill. He wondered who she might become when the world softened again, when the forest thawed, when food returned and her ribs didn't show through her coat. Would she leave? Would she finally speak? Would she ask the questions she never asked before? But she didn't signal to. Instead, she patched the hole in the roof, organized the bullets, scrubbed the kettle twice as long as necessary, and in doing so, she told him everything he needed to know. Some stories didn't need retelling. Some trust wasn't born of answers. And some winters passed not because they were conquered, but because someone kept the fire alive just long enough. Chapter 9, The Last Ride Together. The message came with no sender, just a torn scrap of parchment nailed to a tree near the cabin, weather-worn, smeared with mud, and scrawled in a hand he recognized too well. No threats, no demands, just a date, a name, and a town that hadn't been mentioned in years. It meant one thing: they'd found him again. He stared at it for a long time, boots planted in the snow, the cold creeping through the seams of his coat. The past had never really stopped chasing him. It just waited. And now, it was calling him back to settle something that could only be ended with blood or silence. Back at the cabin, she didn't ask what was written. She only saw the way he stood when he came through the door. Straighter, heavier, like his bones remembered how to carry old burdens. She watched him pack the rifle, the canteen knife he hadn't touched in months. Then she disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she was already dressed for the road, her coat buttoned, her hair tied back, the rifle slung over her shoulder like it belonged there. No words, no hesitation. He opened his mouth, ready to say she didn't have to come, that this was his trouble, his reckoning. But one look from her, the kind that could turn mountains to sand, was enough. They rode out before sunrise. The trail was narrow, half-frozen mud beneath hooves. The forest gave way to open hills, and the air grew thinner, colder. Neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence had always said more than words ever could. By midday, they reached a ridge that overlooked a valley stretched in gold and gray. A wind moved across it like breath, and down below, the silhouette of that forgotten town rested like a waiting coffin. He stopped the horse and dismounted, staring down at what he had once escaped. She remained in the saddle for a moment, then climbed down and stood beside him. She didn't ask who was waiting. She didn't ask why he had to go. She only said, "We ride down together." He turned to her, eyes tired and soft. "You don't owe me this." Her voice didn't shake. "I know." That was it. Not forgiveness, not duty, just a choice. They rode down side by side, the cold slicing their cheeks, the past growing louder. With every step of the horse, she carried the rifle across her back, and he carried the weight of every name he'd never spoken, every grave he'd left behind. In town, the streets were nearly empty. The buildings sagged like old men, and somewhere, a door creaked open with a sound that carried too far. He recognized the figure waiting near the well-long coat, silver buckle, a familiar tilt of the head, a man from before. The girl dismounted first. He wanted to stop her, to tell her to let him face it alone. But she walked ahead, the rifle already in her hands, not raised, just held, like a memory that refused to be buried. The man at the well smiled when he saw her, then frowned when he didn't recognize her. He spoke his name again, the name he had buried beneath years and silence. But this time, the man didn't flinch. He stepped forward and stood beside her, and just like that, it wasn't his story anymore, it was theirs. Chapter 10, The Girl Who Buried the Fire. The end came without thunder, no grand violence. No final standoff beneath a burning sky. It came with the soft hum of wind through brittle grass and the quiet rhythm of his breathing, each one shallower than the last. They had made it out of the valley, left the ghosts behind. The town never asked questions, and he didn't offer answers. For weeks, they stayed in a small house near the edge of a canyon, where the earth dropped off into silence and the sky always felt too wide to hold. His body began to fade slowly, like a campfire burning itself down to the last orange ember. The fever came back, not fierce, but steady, like something he had been holding off for far too long had finally caught up, tired but patient. She cared for him the way he once carried her through smoke. Without instruction, without words. She boiled water, fed him, by hand, sat beside his cot through the nights when he could no longer tell dreams from memory. He spoke sometimes not to her, but to people she didn't know. Names whispered into the rafters, apologies sent to corners of the room where no one stood, and she never cried. Not when his voice cracked, not when his eyes lost their focus. Not even when he began to hold her hand tighter in the middle of the night, like a man trying to anchor himself to the last thing that still made sense. On the final morning, the air was cold and still. A bird sang once, then fell silent. She sat beside him, holding his hand just as she had done when they first escaped the fire. The same hand that once reached into the flames for her. The same hand that built fires, hunted rabbits, and steadied hers when she first learned to shoot. He looked at her one last time, not with fear, not with sorrow, but with something quieter, something that had no name. And then he was gone. She didn't wail, didn't collapse. She folded the blanket over his chest and sat with him until the sun climbed high enough to warm the edge of the porch. Then she stood, took the rifle from beside the door, and walked into the canyon. She dug the hole herself, hands raw, no shovel, no markers, just dirt, breath, and silence. When she finished, she didn't place the rifle on the grave. She buried it, not because she was done fighting, but because he was. That rifle had been a promise, a shield, a memory of every night she sat guard while he slept. Now, with him gone, it had served its purpose. She returned to the porch that evening, watching the light stretch across the land like the final page of a long, wordless story. No one came looking. No one asked what had happened, and she didn't tell, because some stories aren't meant for retelling. Some fires aren't meant to be lit again. Some names, once carried, are laid down only in the hands of those who understood them best. And so she sat, the girl who once came out of the fire, the girl who watched a man die with peace in his chest, the girl who buried the last weapon either of them ever needed, not as a soldier, not as a daughter, but as the keeper of silence.